Picture it. You're driving down a quiet country road. The radio hums in the background. The lane is icy, the sky is dim. Not a car to be seen. You begin to feel a sharp prick of heat in the back of your neck. All of a sudden, a lightning flash. Then, a vision. Rachel Reeves in tears, her white prom dress drenched with blood. Bond traders howling, bankers with cardboard boxes of their possessions marching out of Barclays HQ. The flash fades. What was that? A noise, something scratching. You check in the rear mirror. Is that Javier Milei swinging off a low hook? No, it can't be. He's back in Buenos Aires, having tantric sex and getting bailed out. You pull over at a tiny shop. Get out.
Excuse me.
I'm looking to use your phone, you say. The shop owner, an old, crumpled woman, takes you through a filthy back room and at a brown linoleum counter between three mangy cats, you dial the only number you still know.
Hello?
The voice at the end of the line says,
I'm the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I've made a fortune by using debt.
You reel back, turn away, but now you see the old woman has a man's face, blonde pigtails, his bra exposed. He's pumping milk from his udders. He grins, cackles, and says,
the Russian state became centralized in 862 when, well, there's a city of Novgorod in the northwest of Russia, when they invited Prince Rurik from Scandinavia, from the Vikings, in 862. In 1862, 1,000 years since the establishment of the statehood was marked, and there is a memorial dedicated to that in Novgorod. In 882, the successor of Rurik, Prince Oleg, was a regent to Rurik's young son, came to Kiev.
Coming up this week,
Fright Night on Multipolarity.
We're taking 5 doomsday scenarios and running through how they would play out in ghoulish detail. From Britain disintegrating to America crashing the global economy to forever war on the Eastern Front. And stay tuned for an extra special guest, the Headless Norseman. But first...
Hello everybody and welcome to the Halloween special version of Multipolarity, the Halloween 2025 special, and we're quite excited about it because rather than put the mask on for Halloween, we're going to take the mask off and tell some scary but true stories. The deep truth of Multipolarity, as the podcast, is that we're all not telling viewers or listeners the actual deep truth of the coming collapse, which is only weeks away, actually, in both the US and Europe and also in Britain. So this week, we're going to tell the deep truth of the looming collapse that you're about to experience over the spooky season. So I think we'll start with the United States. It's the most volatile of the three. I don't think that means necessarily it's the worst, but it's certainly the most volatile. And it's beginning to feel really volatile in the United States. Actually, since, not since the beginning of the year, but since the beginning of the Trump administration, we haven't talked that much about internal developments in the United States. I mean, that's mainly because there's enormous changes going on in the world, and frankly, we can't keep up with the amount of stories that are coming out at the moment with regards to global affairs and multipolarity and so on. But I've been keeping one eye certainly on the developments in the United States, and they are really quite extreme, from the assassination of Charlie Kirk recently, which has really been a cultural phenomenon and set off a bunch of dynamics in American society, to what I'm about to talk about, which is the clash between federal agencies and not so much state, but more so city authorities. There's a lot of very strange things happening in the United States right now. Quite extreme, even by American standards. I think sometimes people get a little bit inured to American politics and think that, well, it's kind of weird all the time. People kind of, talk big, and, if you've ever lived in America or visited there, that's kind of part of the culture. So, it's a little bit of a circus, but no big deal, and, people just talk big and nothing happens that much. Okay, we have more political assassinations than most relatively stable countries, but, that's just part of life. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think something really has fundamentally kind of is beginning to creak or snap in the country. Didn't start with Trump. I think it probably started with Obama, but the recent phase probably started under Biden. But we're kind of climbing up the escalation ladder domestically, it feels to me, in America. And I'm hardly the only one. Obviously, Andrew, and we have Malcom Kyeyune here to weigh in on America Doom. But we're not the only ones that think this. There's a lot of talk about some sort of civil breakdown in the United States, not just on the liberal side. Obviously, the liberals are quite fired up right now because the second Trump administration is exercising powers in ways that the first Trump administration doesn't, and it seems to be feeding into the worst nightmares of the liberals, who convinced themselves in the first Trump term that he was going to rule as some sort of fascist dictator. But you're also hearing this on the right. You're hearing this quite extensively on the right if you listen to more conservative podcasts and so on, not even particularly out there ones. They're talking about this kind of mood breaking down, and there's just a general sense of violence, I think, in America. There's no other real way to put it. Some of it's manifest violence, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, of course, which is important because he's not actually a political figure. He's kind of just a guy who talks on campus, and, it's not generally who the targets are for those kind of things. But there's a mood of violence in the country in a way that there isn't in Europe and the United Kingdom at the moment. So the thing that stands out most to me is this conflict between the federal agencies, federal law enforcement agencies like ICE, mainly the immigration agency, and I think also DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, is being deployed for a lot of this stuff. But basically they're going into what are mostly Democrat cities. They used to be known as sanctuary cities. We're not going to go into the history of the entire politics around this, but effectively they kind of declared themselves exempt from the first Trump administration's rules on enforcing immigration controls or immigration arrests. And the whole thing was kind of a LARP in the first Trump administration, mostly because the Trump administration wasn't actually trying that hard to round people up. And so the sanctuary city people said, we're not going to allow you to do that, but nobody actually wanted to do it. But, it got people really, really riled up from a legal point of view because the cities seemed to be defecting from the federal bureaucracy. And you'd hear a lot of things on the conservative side about this being similar to the Civil War, not abiding by the principles of the Federal Republic and so on. Probably a little bit exaggerated, but, legally not completely crazy. Anyway, this wound people up. It's got people really wound up, and now the spring is starting to spring, in a sense. And the Trump administration is sending ICE agents, I think DHS, and I think some National Guard as well. But I think the ICE is the real enforcement mechanism. And they're going in and they're rounding up illegal immigrants. This is creating a reaction in those cities of the mayors and other authorities saying that, the police shouldn't work with these federal agencies, they shouldn't enforce the laws that they're telling them. And of course, what this does is it sets up a conflict between the federal agency and the city level agency. And it's a conflict not between people who are trying to collect import taxes. It's a conflict between people who hold guns and enforce the law. Those are the kind of conflicts that start actual civil conflicts. It's the sort of conflict where people start asking, okay, well, whose side are the police on? Whose side are the federal agents on? Whose side is that police chief on? What are his politics? This is where politics gets a little bit scary. And my reading of it, others can correct me if they think I'm being a bit extreme, is this could really blow up. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to blow up into some sort of shooting war between local city police and ICE agents or anything like that. But standoffs. It creates the real possibility of a standoff and of something really quite bad happening. You know, ICE agents go in, they're trying to round up a bunch of illegal immigrants and, you know, an illegal factory or dry cleaners or something like that, and the police move to protect them on behalf of the mayor, you know, who could be connected to the guy who runs the factory. You never know. And something can happen. A tinderbox moment can happen. And those are the kind of moments where somebody, you know, a bullet goes stray, or somebody beats up someone else, or somebody manhandles somebody, or something goes wrong, and it becomes a kind of national rallying point. That's what you tend to see in these scenarios. So that's kind of my take. That's what I'd be looking at for the enormous political instability that's almost certainly coming in the run-up to Halloween in the United States.
Yeah, I can basically add to that. I agree with the case you lay out here, but I could add to that we're looking at something that is sort of similar to the remit of the Multipolarity podcast itself, in terms of, you know, the basic argument of multipolarity here is that we have lived in a sort of steady state system, which is unipolarity. And we're now entering a period of chaos and sort of everything being reordered violently. And then eventually we will reach a new sort of steady state, which will be some sort of multipolar world. And so the task now is to sort of try to pick through the rubble even as it keeps bouncing. Well, I think that you can see something very similar happening in America right now, where you have the latest attacks right now as we're recording this on the American welfare system. So through this shutdown, it seems now that SNAP, that is food stamps, those benefits will be affected. And people are working themselves up into a ladder about, oh, we have all of these useless eaters, and like welfare should only be like a very temporary thing, and they should get paid in like pasta or whatever, because otherwise there's so much fraud, blah, 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 blah. And also you have all of these racial arguments. It's like, oh, well, it's just illegal immigrants and black people and not real Americans and so on, even though if you look at the numbers, the people who will be worst impacted in a way in terms of absolute numbers are people in red states and even like poor whites who voted for Donald Trump. But the thing about welfare systems and why it's very, very sort of spooky, I would say, that the Americans are attacking them is that, you know, America models itself on the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic had its own very famous welfare system called the grain dole. And the history behind the grain dole is that, like, once in the early days of the Roman Republic, the ideal of the polity was that of the citizen soldier. So, like, you couldn't join the army, you couldn't be a part of the military unless you owned land, unless you were an independent farmer. And the Roman Republic saw itself as a republic of, you know, independent free men, and to be a free man, you had to own property. But the problem is that the more the Roman Republic went to war, the easier it became for people who, you know, found medical deferments or whatever and stayed back home inside Rome to gobble up the land of the people, the soldiers that actually went to war. So you had this huge consolidation of land in the hand of the knight class, the equites. And eventually, like, the social model that the Roman Republic was built on broke down. And you had all of these people who used to be landowners. They gathered in the cities as the proletari, which is where Marx got the term the proletariat from. And these people had to be fed somehow. Like, you couldn't, you know, send them back to work, because like rich magnates had gobbled up all the land and they were making a killing. Like they weren't doing subsistence agriculture. They were turning all of this land they had stolen into these big, agribusinesses run by slaves and producing crops, like cash crops for export. So it was a huge money-making machine. But the people who had been dispossessed, you had to deal with them somehow. Which is why Rome, throughout its history, had this like schizophrenic view where you had all of these rich Roman conservatives saying, oh, well, having all of these welfare recipients, like it's bad for the Roman spirit. Like this isn't the ideals Rome was founded on. We need to cut the grain dole and get these people back to work. Meanwhile, they were pocketing all the profits from that new system. And so you couldn't actually, like they weren't about to hand back the land or anything. So all attempts to reform the grain dole failed. Like the Roman Republic was becoming the Roman Empire. And the social contract of the empire was, yes, we took your land and we took your ability to be like citizens of a republic in the old sense. But here is a bunch of bread and circuses. America is just the same. Like, if you think about it, like you have all of these hoary old notions of, oh, well, food stamps, welfare, it's only for a short time before you get a job. The job market is terrible. Like, if you go to college, you learn to code, like, you're not going to get, like, a job. You're not going to be able to pay off your student loans. You're not going to be able to afford to live. The amount of people who are food insecure is, like, 2.5 times greater inside the American military than in the American civilian realm. So even like people inside the military are on welfare. And you look at something like Walmart, like a big chunk of their revenue comes from welfare, and they hire people that they don't pay enough money to actually not be on food stamps themselves. So food stamps, all of these welfare systems are like completely critical for the American empire to survive in its like, post-World War II, post-1970s, like deindustrialized but cheap imports sort of social compact. Once you start abolishing that, that is basically going from a functioning imperial model to knocking down all the supports. And once you do that, it's going to be chaos. It's going to be absolute chaos.
I think looking from afar and not being quite as immersed in American politics as either Malcolm or Philip, one thing that would really concern me if I was American is that I have felt during this federal government shutdown that there's far less interest on any side in actually making a deal this time. Like I'm sure there are discussions and talks going on, but usually when this happens, like when you're not really following American politics, it's always there in the background if you're on X, formerly Twitter, or, you read The Guardian or the Telegraph. Like, American politics is always there in the background. So you get a general impression of the vibe. And when there's a government shutdown, federal government shutdown, there's always a huge amount about serious efforts to get some kind of deal done to, and that can feel at times almost quite desperate. The blame game is pretty hysterical. And I mean hysterical from the word hysteria rather than meaning very funny. And there seems like a big effort on both sides to find some kind of compromise, even if those efforts to find a compromise are really hardball efforts and really take the other side to the mat. This time, though, I don't feel that degree of urgency. And my general impression is that all sides have pretty strong reasons for not wanting a solution to this. I get the impression that a really quite significant number on the Republican side of the argument actually just want this to go on. Like, I get the impression that there's a lot of people there who secretly, or even not so secretly, actually just want the government to shut down. Like, actually just want it to finish, to crack, essentially. Like, I get the feeling that some people higher up, well, some people, the rank and file, the supporters, the people on the right, some of them, as Malcolm mentioned earlier on, just want the government to shut down so some of their pet hates, whether it be like food stamps or, I don't know, like Medicare or Medicaid or whatever it is, can just get shut down, like the payments can stop. I think there are a lot of people who just would like that, like those people are getting my tax dollars and I'm not happy with that. They're not using it properly or they're unworthy of it. And I'm not passing judgment on that. I think all of us at some stage have, had issues with people on our streets who are, we might feel would be better off getting a job, for example. I'm not judging them, but I definitely feel there's that general sense abroad among rank and file Republicans that, maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing if food stamps just finished altogether. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing if Medicare payments or Medicaid payments just finished, right? Like, I think that, or, student loans or whatever the government funding goes toward. But I think higher up in the Republican Party, there's this general sense that this is perhaps an opportunity to roll the government right back to certainly pre-Great Society, pre-LBJ days, okay? And maybe even pre-FDR, New Deal days, right? This idea that maybe the government can just stop, can just stop working and we can go back to a much smaller government, not just a bit small, but like way smaller. Like, this is a way for Doge to essentially take root by default. This is a means to get to Ron Paul's libertarian heaven. Meantime, on the Democrat side, maybe there are some people going, okay, let's go, let's have it. Please let the economy break down. Let all this government funding stop. Let all of that pain happen on your watch. Come on, let's have it, and then we'll wipe the floor with you at the midterms, and we'll probably win the White House back. And all this libertarian talk will be destroyed forever. Come on, let's have this. And I think maybe Trump quite likes the idea of it because maybe it'll provide an excuse to garner more executive power. Maybe it puts him, if he can avoid the blame on this in a stronger position to actually govern without those pesky congressmen getting in the way. And I just feel that when any nation gets to the stage where all sides are thinking, are just ready for a battle and actually actively want a battle. Like, okay, this is the time when we can go down this route. Like, this is the time to make it happen. A bit like a kind of World War I build-up situation where all of the sides in World War I, for their own reasons, were like, we need a war. We need this final battle to be now. And ultimately, we're going to win this battle and the world is going to be better because of that. Like, when all sides get to that position, it's really dangerous. It's like you've seen this for years in the US where sides have started treating each other as enemies and rather than as opponents. And I think that's like a serious issue. I think this this government shutdown is taking the US toward that kind of denouement, that kind of final moment of the gods of America, essentially. I don't know how either of you two feel about that.
I completely agree. I think that's right on the money. There is this sense of exhaustion where it's like, the death drive takes over. Like, you can tell people, and like you're seeing this in the discussion. People who are proponents of cutting off food stamps are just casually admitting, this is going to lead to rioting and chaos and social breakdown. And that's a good thing. Because then we will see the truth of society and we'll be able to send in the military and just shoot them. The problem here, though, is that
by the way, that's a common thing. I'm sorry to interrupt, Malcolm, but I've spoken to a couple of guys on the kind of far right-hand side of the British spectrum about immigration and like I've been arguing against, just deporting every foreigner against these guys. And I say things like, if you go into these communities heavy-handed, then there's going to be like massive riots. There's going to be like huge unrest. It's questionable whether we'll. And they always say, good, Bring it on. That's exactly what we want. Like, because then we'll have the excuse to deal with this once and for all. This is a common refrain.
Yeah, but the problem is, though, and this is kind of what I meant by exhaustion, if you ask these people to think about, like, okay, but you're not paying the troops. You're going to send in the troops to risk their own lives, and you're going to do so illegally, probably. Like, you're not even going to bother with, like, checking whether, like, the deployment is in line with the Constitution or not. You're just going to send them in, and they're not going to get paid. And they're going to be fighting a fight that's not really theirs. And it's like, yeah, sure, whatever. Like, don't be a spoilsport. Like, there is just this kind of hunger for destruction here. And that destruction is kind of self-destruction in a way. The real problem here is that this is the most predictable crisis in sort of the history of the human species. Like, you have people on social media saying, like, we don't have any money left. There's nothing, like, we can't even afford food. Like, if we don't get this, like, there's going to be riots. And people say, oh, well, you're not going to do anything. I tend to think that, like, they're not even sleepwalking into crisis this time and collapse. They're doing it with eyes wide open.
Yeah, I think the characterization of the moment of kind of a death drive in America is exactly where the place is at. I mean, it's always been lurking there for kind of years, but it was a little bit LARPy for a long time. But I think people are getting really serious now. I think what sparked off the mood immediately was the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I mean, I really think that just polarized the country in a way that both sides became kind of convinced that the other person was going to kill them.
Yeah. Just to cut in 1 second here, COVID was also a huge contributor. Like, COVID really turbocharged everything, like the lockdowns.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's been building for years. I just mean with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that felt to me the moment where, like, people were like, I've been suspecting that my neighbor might, like, shoot me for, like, 10 years, but now I'm actually worried that I might get shot. And, you know, there's a difference between considering the case of violence somewhere in the future. We'll talk about that in the UK later. It's kind of nonsense most of the time. And, like, wow, I'm immediately, like, scared of violence right now. And yeah, it feels to me like they've kind of gone into full death drive mode in America. So yeah, it's all very spooky and Halloween-esque. So moving to Halloween in Europe this year, October 2025, moving into November, into the autumn season, Europe is feeling spooky on its own. Super spooky, but in a different way. I don't think the death drive has been unleashed in Europe, but there are collective hysterias of a sort taking hold, and the collective hysterias are beginning to reveal certain truths that some of us have known to be the fact for quite some time. So I think the hysteria in Europe is around the war. The Europeans have now finally woken up to the fact that they're going to lose a war with Russia, and they don't know what that means. I've been surprised at the fact that many people in senior leadership positions in Europe, I don't mean at the Commission, I mean at a national level too, actually believed the narrative that Putin's war was the beginning of an invasion of Europe. I thought it was all fake. I thought it was all propaganda to stir people up and justify, you know, pouring billions of dollars into people who had not that much interest in Ukraine. You tell them it's for their own security. It's beginning to look like they actually believe that. But they believed it in a funny way. They didn't believe it in the way that they're going to launch missiles at Russia tomorrow. They're not going to do that. They're backing down. But they believed it in a way that when you take away the illusion as it's beginning to be stripped back, and they're beginning to be confronted with, well, if I was right about Putin's tanks rolling into Europe if the AFU isn't standing in their way, if I was right about that, we're going to see that in real time in the next year, maybe the next 18 months. And they're beginning to wake up to the fact that, like, that's not going to happen. I don't think anyone actually, I mean, maybe some wackos in the Baltics or something think that's going to happen, but most people do not think that's going to happen, including in the leadership class. And so what they're beginning to realize is that they were believing in nonsense for a couple of years. And that can be really, really disorienting for people. And the immediate thing that sparked off, we've alluded to it in previous episodes, but I actually think it's more important than it's being given credit for, is the drone hysteria that we've seen around Europe. That is sort of the cathartic effect of the collapse of the illusion around the war. What's basically happened, I'm going to be absolutely frank about it, is that certain military or security services in Europe have decided to try and psy up the population by stirring up a hysteria around drones. And basically it started with this so-called Russian incursion of drones with no explosives on them from Poland into Ukraine. And it set off a wave of hysteria, as these things always do. Talk to anyone who works in that kind of security sector and they'll say, be very careful about scaring the public because it tends to spread like wildfire. That's exactly what happened here. And the last one I saw this week was that Latvia have started shooting down weather balloons because Belarusians are using them to smuggle cigarettes over the border. It was Lithuania, sorry if I said Latvia, into Lithuania. So they are now shooting down weather balloons that are being used to smuggle cigarettes. Absurd stuff. And by the way, not just shooting down weather balloons, I think they shut down their national airport 4 times on the back of these weather balloons that were bringing in cigarettes. Okay, so it all seems very funny and very silly. And in a sense it's funny, and in a sense it's silly. But it's the breaking. It's the breaking of a moment in the minds of those people. It's the outward manifestation of that. And they're beginning to crack up. They're beginning to ask themselves, what is Europe going to look like after the war? What have we done? We've cut off our energy. We're deindustrializing. We alienated China. We don't have a great relationship with the United States. What's our security situation going to look on those borders? In places like Finland and the Baltics, they probably don't think they're going to get invaded. I mean, some of the loonies there probably do, but they're probably waking up to the fact it's not going to be fun living on a border with a country that you borderline declared war on. That's not going to be fun. The second thing that came out, and I think it's related, is this story in Politico about Belgium. It was specifically about Antwerp, but it's basically about all the Belgian cities outside of Bruges and maybe Ghent or something like that, the more touristy ones, which are still pretty much what they always were. Belgium is a massively corrupt country now. The Politico headline, it was a letter, an anonymous letter written by an investigative judge in Antwerp he'd had enough. And he wrote this letter into Politico, a very mainstream pro-EU organization. This is not Sputnik News, okay? And he said basically that Belgium had descended into a narco state, that mafia-like structures had taken hold in the cities at every level. Now, he only said that elusively, at every level, but I know plenty of people who live in Belgium. Some of them are investigative reporters, some of them work in the parliament, some of them are researchers, some of them are in think tanks. It is widely known that the city is controlled by organized crime. Not fully controlled, but pretty controlled by organized crime. It's an unusual system they have. They have multiple mayors. I can't remember how many. Maybe it's 8, maybe it's 12. I can't remember. And basically mayoral positions are used as organized crime fronts. You walk around Brussels, there's construction everywhere, but nothing's getting done. It's money laundering. The money laundering is everywhere. You can see it. Drugs are coming in through the port in Belgium. It's everywhere. And they're beginning to admit that. Now, I put on Twitter a post that got like 150,000 views or something. I said, Belgium, Brussels, the capital of Europe, is currently in a situation that is basically identical to Moscow in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Criminals are in control. Politicians, maybe at a lower level, maybe not, are doing business with criminals. Business, if it wants to get done in Belgium, goes through criminal networks. That's Moscow in the 1990s. And this isn't some obscure town in southern Spain. This isn't some place in Sicily. This is the center of the European Union. Now, that's shocking for some people. It's not shocking for me. I've known it for a long time. A lot of people, it's an open secret in political circles. The question is, why are they admitting to it now? And I think they're admitting to it now for the same reason that the illusions are falling away about this war. We're about to get a waking up to the reality of what's actually happening in Europe. The bankruptcies of various governments, the collapse of German industry, the lack of an economic model moving forward, the fact that the capital's being taken over by organized crime, this sort of thing, it's all going to come out. All the bugs are going to come out now. And I don't think it's going to create the kind of freak out that we just talked about in America. Different dynamic, but it's going to create something.
Yeah, I've always been, accused of being a doomer, but my base case for Europe is kind of very different from the US. In the US, people are gearing up to, kill their neighbors or whatever before their neighbors kill them. Like, it's just this bloodlust, death drive. Like the Europe, by contrast, like what we are heading towards, and you alluded to this several times, it's not just like the situation in Moscow in the 90s. I would say that an even more apropos comparison is that of the entire like Warsaw Pact as the Soviet Union collapsed. You had all of these countries. You had like Yugoslavia, you had Czechoslovakia, you had Poland, you had East Germany, and so on. And it's like, okay, what are these independent socialist republics gonna do? Like, socialism is dead. Like, Russia is no longer, answering the phone. So what do you do? Like, what do you become in a post-socialist world? And I mean, a country like Hungary has already been through that experience once. So I think they have a head start in going through that again, except this time it's not the Warsaw Pact, it's the NATO alliance. And the world order that implies that falls apart. But like, if you look at the post-collapse situation in Europe, a lot of these new leaders were basically just like communist sort of power brokers and oligarchs and party men who then like founded new quote-unquote democratic parties and sort of like shed their skin like a snake to become like this new thing. I think we're gonna see a lot of that in Europe, actually. Like, I think we will all be surprised at the speed at which some of these Eurocrats basically, without skipping a single beat, turn into like multipolarity boosters and, talking about like international trade and like a system based on equal rights for all and like no bullying like America used to do. And if they do, like, are the Chinese gonna throw them out? No. Like, I don't really think that there are any real incentives. If you think about like Nexperia in Holland, for example, the Netherlands, it was incredibly foolish to try to confiscate on the orders from the Americans. This Chinese Dutch company, which had all of its production in China, and we're seeing the results of it now. A breakdown in supply lines for German auto industry, but also American auto industry, interestingly enough. And the Europeans are getting desperate. They're trying to like phone Beijing frantically, like, can't we find some sort of compromise here? And the Chinese are being absolutely adamant, like, you stole from us, return everything you stole, and then we'll talk. And the Europeans are trying, we're not going to return it, but are you sure we can't find some other way, like, to live peacefully together? The problem or the benefit here for Europe is that there's just not a lot we can do to really harm ourselves in the same, like, beyond recovery. Like, yes, we can try to steal Nexperia and then fall flat on our face. We can cheer as someone blows up Nord Stream. But we can't actually, like, nobody wants to start, like, an internal civil war. Like, that seems to be the case increasingly in the US. And, like, we can't start a war with Russia. We can't start a war with China. Like, we can't even get to China physically. So that's not going to happen. And at the end of the day, like, the collapse of a political order, like we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's kind of like a debt jubilee. It's kind of like a blank slate in a lot of ways. So, Philip, like, your narrative here, where it's like this bonfire of ideology that leads to a lot of chaos and confusion and fear because people don't want to contemplate what happens next, I think that's right on the money.
Yeah, I think Europe is heading for a really very dark place. I'm super pessimistic about Europe, and I think Halloween is a good time to talk about it. It's been known, and it's actually very well understood, that those people who lead the EU, the kind of like the EU deep state, if you like, the true believers in the EU project, have always understood that the EU would take leaps forward during crises. They always understood that it would take crises to force countries to give up their sovereignty. One example of that was during the financial crises, when the EU garnered fiscal oversight powers, for example. Another example was during COVID, when they were able to issue a joint bond for recovery. It wasn't a great amount, but it was something. It was a precedent that had been set. They also took powers when it came to vaccine purchasing and other medical supply purchasing. And I think that in these crowds, the Ukraine conflict has just been really too tempting as a means to push forward the project of ever greater union and to push towards something like a federal state, even if it's at first a confederation. And I think the problem with that, in particular, and why I really think the EU is moving to a very dark place, is that the crisis that they choose to take the process forward is important in itself. And if they're going to choose an external enemy that they're going to build up, I think that's a really dangerous precedent. Like if you look at the countries or groupings in history that have chosen an external enemy as their chief animating force, as their chief raison d'etre, rather than some kind of positive idea of unity of a people or unity of an ideal in the case of America. If you look at the nations or empires that have chosen an external threat as the key means of moving forward, you're into the territory of Bolshevik Russia, of Nazi Germany, of modern day Iran, for example. Like you're into a territory where it's like the international Jewry, the state of Israel and the great Satan America, like the capitalist imperialist wreckers from the West. Okay, and this is the direction that the Europeans are heading down. It's like they're choosing this external threat as the main animating force of what's going to bring Europe together. And I think the problem is, as they face ever-increasing problems of, as you guys have mentioned, of deindustrialization, of the rise of populists as a response to that, of immigration and integration issues, of the costs that, shackling themselves to the US security umbrella are going to entail increasingly as the US moves into conflict with China. It's just going to be extraordinarily tempting for EU elites to use this external threat, the Putin, the external boogeyman, to justify all kinds of pretty nasty, pretty unpleasant, pretty authoritarian laws and steps, and also to justify the privation that European citizens are going to have to go through as living standards decrease and as living standards and public services and infrastructure slowly crumble. And I think that suggests a very dark future for Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just a matter of perspective. I think that it's going to be about as bright as a rainy London day. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's certainly not that great either. Like the main upside we have is just that we are basically like the patient, like in one of those straitjackets in like a padded cell. And we can try to really bang our head against the wall and do real damage to ourselves. But like we are kind of limited by our own weakness in a sense in really trying to obliterate ourselves. If Europe was actually like had militaries, like decent sized militaries, we'd be at war right now. And like the price we'd be paying, like it would be another like World War. Or something similar in terms of the destruction visited upon our societies. Like our politicians would gladly, like throw a generation into the wood chipper, but we can't. We don't have the tanks. We don't have the soldiers. Nobody wants to fight. We don't have the money, which is, it's bleak, but it's also a blessing in disguise, I would say.
I think the scariest fright of all for this Halloween is probably going to be the future of the UK. I think we're in a position now where it's possible to envisage a future of the United Kingdom in which the United Kingdom no longer exists. It breaks up. Scotland leaves. Northern Ireland reunifies with the Republic of Ireland. Wales then leaves as well, because what's the point of staying around? Britain loses the Falkland Islands to Argentina, and ultimately therefore loses Gib as well. And all that's left is England, and an England which has, in relative terms, late 2000s, early 2010s Eastern European living standards, but going the other way, so without the redeeming feature of life improving and things getting better, and is faced with a Northern Ireland type simmering sectarian conflict and violence, but across the whole of England. So a kind of a United Kingdom that's broken up. Scotland left much poorer because it would be in a situation where it left the United Kingdom. England left with Eastern European living standards from the late 2000s, early 2010s, and with simmering sectarian violence, a la Northern Ireland 1972 to 1989. That's how I can imagine. Well, how will that happen? Well, first of all, the Treasury is already grinding down on living standards. Philip Pilkington and I have spoken about this on more than one occasion on Multipolarity. You can go and search for those episodes, but we've talked about it constantly, that His Majesty's Treasury is essentially using insider kind of deep state governments led by people like Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer to manage living standards within the United Kingdom downward. In addition to that, the genie of ethnic violence is now out of the bottle in Britain. We saw it with the Southport riots, and it's continued to a lesser degree with the hotel protests as well. But the genie of ethnic violence is out of the bottle, and that will get worse as living standards decrease, and the kind of like the grinding, crushing reduction in living standards continues probably for another decade or more. Meantime, places like the Falkland Islands are now very much under threat, because as the US moves into great power competition with China, or as both powers move into competition with each other, that security competition will be ruthless, and it'll take precedence over everything else. We already see it take precedence over the economy, and it'll certainly take precedence over any vestiges that might be left after the Iraq War, after Syria, after Libya, after Ukraine, after all the rest of any kind of pretense of a rules-based order. And as time progresses, South America is going to be a very live playing field. It's the US backyard, it's Monroe Doctrine territory, but almost all of the countries in South America now have China as their main trading partner. Well, what if Argentina comes to the world and says, like, look, we want the Falklands back, and now is time to reopen negotiations. Maybe it takes them 10 years or so while they recover from the basket case that they are economically already. But let's say they come to the world. Well, the Global South will take the Argentinian side. The Chinese will take the Argentinian side because they'll see it as a great way to stick it to the Americans in the court of public opinion. The Europeans will take the Argentinian side because, we can kick the Brits again. And also the Spanish will lobby very hard to take the Argentinian side because they'll see it as a domino that would fall and knock over the Gibraltar domino. And that leaves the US and Britain isolated. And the US will eventually say, look, we can't deal with this, the hit to our diplomacy in South America. So I'm sorry, Mr. Prime Minister, but you're going to have to negotiate on this one. Then after that, Jib will fall as well. So it's really easy to see this kind of scenario happening in Britain at the moment. And how unlikely is it? Well, it's Halloween. We're coming up to remember the 5th of November. So I'll leave that up to you guys.
I'll come in on something slightly different in Britain. I mean, of course, I completely agree with you. The one thing I'd say is I think currently the fantasies of civil war in Britain are fantasies. And I think what they're actually covering up is that British people are getting a real whack of decline at the moment. Like, I haven't been back recently, but our producer was back recently and sent us some minor text message reports. And they confirm what I'd seen when I'd gone back about 6 months ago, and then 6 months, and then 6 months. And every time it was just noticeably getting worse. I mean, it was, I was staying in a hotel and it was just noticeably getting worse. I didn't have to I wasn't in Birmingham watching the bins not be collected. They're not being collected in Birmingham. It's full of rats, just FYI. Apparently that's spread to other cities. Didn't have to even see that. I could just tell by the public transportation in London. I could tell by the grime in the streets. I could tell by the public mood is just so low. And I think the reason that there's this kind of civil war meme going around Britain at the moment is because people kind of, not in the death drive sense that we talked about America, but people kind of want something to snap. Because they want something to snap because they're like, I don't want this to keep grinding on. And maybe if something snapped, at least we'd get a kind of a clarification of what this is all about. And then, it might snap back over time.
Can I ask when you say, I'm sorry to interrupt, can I ask when you say, you don't think there'll be a civil war, what you mean by that? Because I don't think there's going to be, standing armies of fellow Britons engaging in kind of pitched battles on Bosworth Field or something like that. But I can very much imagine, Philip, a situation something like the Troubles in Northern Ireland taking place, where it's a kind of terrorism and counter-terrorism war. I mean, there are more than one type of war. It doesn't have to be, standing armies engaging in combined arms battle. It can be something like the Troubles. It could be something like Afghanistan in between the two, right? And I can really imagine it being something like the Troubles, something even marginally worse than that.
If I'm to be absolutely frank, I think that the Civil War narrative is partly organic and being spread around and talked about because of what I'm talking about, a kind of cope mechanism. But I think also the security services in Britain are preparing for the decline. And I think that they are going to use the same tools that they use in Northern Ireland to manage that. And Britain is gradually becoming a really extreme police state. I thought that is happening before our eyes. And we don't really see the effects of it, but it's there, lingering in the background. It's becoming 1984. So I think that's basically what's happening. Yes, of course, there could be civil conflict down the line. If living standards fall to a certain extent, there could be conflict between whites and Muslims or something like that in Birmingham or whatever. This is what people fear. But I think the main day-to-day impact of that will be this insane securitization of the country. Again, to refer to our producer, I hope I'm not giving away too much, but he sent us a photo of this insanely securitized Tesco when he went back. And I know there's always been a bit of a problem in Britain with this over-securitization of nonsense things, but it was just such a striking image. I saw it and I said, yeah, that's exactly what I thought. Constant, updates from some local securitocrat telling the head of Tesco, who then tells all the employees, like, things are coming down the pipeline, and like shield screens being put up everywhere. That's exactly what I expected. The securitization of a society in terminal decline. It's absolutely tragic. But just to switch gears for a moment, the other thing that happened recently is that it was reported in the Financial Times that the Tony Blair Institute had to restructure. It had to fire a bunch of people, I think. I didn't read the full article, but basically it wasn't bringing in the contracts it used to bring in. Now, I think Multipolarity listeners are absolutely allowed, especially given that it's Halloween, to take a dance on the grave of the Tony Blair Institute if it collapses. It is one of the world's most revolting institutes. You don't even want to look into it. Not even at Halloween. It's just that scary. But the fact of the matter is that the Tony Blair Institute is sort of the pinnacle of the really shady part of the British elite structure. And it really represents that, putting out this kind of, we've talked about it on the podcast before, the face of the human rights lawyer and a skull with worms in it behind that face, doing some dirty stuff all around the world, really questionable stuff all around the world. That is the Tony Blair Institute. And it's sort of imagine if like the British Empire declines and so on. Imagine if it's an apple and like it looks beautiful on the outside and it continues to look really nice even though it's kind of gone away. And then you realize it's full of worms. And that's kind of what's happened. It's not anyone's fault. It's just the way kind of imperial decline tends to happen. Well, the fact that the Tony Blair Institute is no longer able to pull in the contracts that it used to, and it's obvious why that's happening. The world is changing. You no longer need some sleazy politician in Britain to do filthy things for you. You don't need that anymore. So what's going to happen there is that entire remaining really sleazy aspect of the British elite is going to fall apart. It's going to just completely just go. And my suspicion is that the energies will be turned inward in Britain. I think that's basically what's going to happen. Something exactly identical, by the way, happened in the Soviet Union. I'm not making moral judgments here at all. The Soviet Union's the same thing. It's an imperial structure. And then as the whole thing shrinks, as it kind of implodes onto itself, what happens? All the guys going off doing funny stuff in the Central Asian republics or here and there, they come back to the core. They come back to Moscow. And what do? They join the mafia. That's what they do. They start doing really sleazy stuff. They start being oligarchs. They start looting the local, what's left of the local, scrap firms or whatever you want to call it. And they start preying on their own people. And I see evidence of that in Britain right now. I saw recently the Financial Times, their lunch with the FT, which is a supposed kind of, if you get lunch with the FT, it used to be seen as a very kind of, ooh, you've really made it. You're now at the top of British society. You're a top diplomat. You're a top corporate executive. Maybe you're a top intellectual. Not many of them left in Britain these days. It was the CEO of OnlyFans. By the way, an Irish woman, which is very funny, but the CEO of OnlyFans. She was some person from one of these so-called magic circle law firms who, by the way, if you're the CEO of OnlyFans, if you're staff of the CEO of OnlyFans, you don't deserve those fancy titles anymore. You're pornographers. Okay? I mean, that's what you're doing. I mean, it's a sleazy. It used to be in Britain that you had to go down to King's Cross Road and there'd be a peep show operating over there, run by the local criminals. Okay, so that gives you a sense of it. Like when Lunch with the FT is advertising British pornography companies, and that's being laundered through the magic circle law firms, it's the beginning of the end. And I think, again, I mean, we talked about the kind of Brussels and the gangsterization of Brussels and elements of the collapse of the Soviet Union there. Britain are going to get it doubly hard. I think it's going to seep really deep into British society because it's a very commercial society. It's always been a very commercial society. And if you have a very commercial society like that and you allow standards to slip and you have all this energy that used to be focused outward into the world that starts coming back just like it did in the Soviet Union, that is a recipe for predation of the highest order. So I think the place is going to just become a really, really bleak place to live.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing here, and this is kind of a running theme for our three areas of study for this episode. It's like there is a big moment of decision coming. Like that is the old Greek definition of a crisis, where it's like you're on a set path, and the crisis is the point where you can no longer continue along that path. You have to make a choice. You have to go in some other direction. I mean, and in the US, if you think about it, like let's say we're right here about Spooktober and, the imminent sort of collapse and sort of civil strife and all of that stuff. The current American empire is never coming back. Like no American would want to bring it back, and it's not really something that's feasible to bring back. I think like the American empire was formed more by accident than by design. And whatever comes after, if it's like regional organizations of states or whatever, like they're not going to be super interested in going back to having 11 aircraft carriers that you can't pay maintenance on. And for Europe, it's kind of like it's up in the air, but my sense is that we're going to see something similar to like European elites remaking themselves to accept multipolarity in the same way that Soviet Eastern European elites remade themselves into becoming like, boosters for liberal democracy or whatever, like pride parades. The UK though, it's gnarly, man. Like, I mean, I know you've played Fallout London, Philip. And I always found, like, when I played that, I found it like very funny on the nose in a way. Like it's a post-apocalyptic story. Like the big global thermonuclear war has happened, and the games are usually set in America. And in America, like all these different kinds of societies and like super mutants and blah blah blah, like it's more of a sci-fi story over there. But the UK, like post-apocalyptic UK, it's basically like London is the only place that still like exists. I mean, there are probably Britons living elsewhere in Old Blighty, but like nobody really knows for sure. So you have London and its immediate environs, and you have the same like civil service preserved from before the war, and the entire kind of plot of the game is just that the civil service is more or less conspiring, like they don't trust the political class, so they're conspiring to replace all politicians with clones in order to keep the civil service going for a bit longer. And so you're doing all of these psyops and like these terrorist acts and so on, just on the orders from some civil service bureaucrat in order to keep like it's not even like this bureaucrat has any sort of tyrannical vision, like this is my perfect society or whatever. It's just, this is how the UK looked 200 years ago when I was still alive. Like, and I would like it to look the same in 250 years. So like all of this terror, it's just for the sake of keeping the sort of stagnancy going. And there is something, like I think that's kind of an on-the-nose criticism of the UK today, in the sense that so much of Great Britain's problems seem to be tied to like this remnant of the empire. Like the empire doesn't exist in actual reality, but its legacy in terms of like how the politicians and how the bureaucrats and so on think, people can't move on from it. It's very weird in a way, like how dominant that sort of sense of we need to keep things going, and we need to keep up appearances, and we need to keep hold of all of our like pretty irrelevant colonial possessions, where there's 300 Britons living or whatever, but we have to keep defending that. It is kind of something you could easily see the British elite spending an insane amount of resources to keep hold of.
Yeah, let me just give one example from this week. You've just brought it to mind. I saw a article in Bloomberg. It was about the British military, which I'm going to be frank. I'm not trying to be mean to the service people in the military. I'm friends with some people who served in Afghanistan and so on, the British military. But it's become a grift. The military's become a giant grift there. And I saw this article. They're over in Latvia in the forest doing these exercises, presumably that like the British Army is going to fight the Russians or something. Now, if you know anything about the British Army, there's this enormous recruitment crisis. Like, they can't staff anything. When the Red Sea crisis occurred, the Americans requested that they send one of their 2 aircraft carriers. Why Britain has 2 aircraft carriers, I have no idea. Costs an arm and a leg. But they said, can you send an aircraft carrier to actually be a bit of a help against the Houthis? You don't even need like our supersonic jets, which, as Malcolm's pointed out in the past, F-16s aren't all that, or Super Hornets aren't all that. But, you know, you don't even need that because you're against the Houthis. You know, you're not flying against air defense. You're just like bombing empty terrain, basically, which was what that little war was all about. But, you know, send them down because it could save us some fuel, it could save us some missiles, you know, whatever. And the British were like, well, we can't send them down because we don't have enough staff to put on the aircraft carrier. And nobody thought to themselves to ask, why are we paying for 2 aircraft carriers if we can't staff one of them? That's the British military. That's the British military in a nutshell. It makes the problems in the American military look insignificant in regard. And when you realise that it's not criticised, you realise it's a grift. And that's what my friends tell me who've worked at senior levels in the British military. They say it's a grift. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. But anyway, this thing goes back to the little Latvian exercise. And they say, in recognition of the fact that Britain has this enormous recruitment crisis, the MOD has decided, or the government's decided, to give the MOD the capacity to pump £4 billion, okay, into a new project. And the new project is that the British military contractors, I think there's only one, it's BAE Systems, British military contractors are going to develop drones. Okay, maybe they can develop drones. The Americans are having a hard enough time of that, just to say. But let's say, for the sake of argument, the British military-industrial complex could create drones. And robots. Haha, come on. I mean, where the hell is the robot industry in Britain? They don't even have a car industry anymore. They're going to create drones and robots. And then, here's what they're going to do. They're going to create some sort of a control system. I'm not really sure what it's supposed to be. I guess it's like the Skynet out of Terminator or something. Literally, Skynet is what they seem to be thinking about. They're going to create Skynet, and Skynet's going to control the robots and the drones. And they're not going to need any men anymore. So the recruitment crisis is fine because you can replace it with robots, drones, and Skynet. And they never stopped to ask themselves before they poured £4 billion into this project, gee whiz, why haven't the Chinese or the Russians or the Americans for Ukraine come up with this Skynet idea? It would be saving so much in terms of personnel. Why haven't they done it? Because obviously it's not possible. So what the British military are claiming there is that they're going to do what the Chinese military can't do, what the US military can't do, what the Russian military can't do. And they're going to do it to shore up their recruitment crisis. I mean, that is a perfect encapsulation of what you're talking about, Malcolm.
Yeah, and just to add one thing here, like if you compare Britain to Sweden, I can't imagine Swedish politicians still talking about pride parades and human rights and, I don't know, like Xinjiang province or whatever, like the Uyghurs. They're like making that sort of thing part of their self-conception in 20 years. I think that's completely impossible. Like, Swedish politicians have shifted gears. They've been like pro-third world, sort of non-aligned. They've been like the biggest friends of the US. They changed their colors like a chameleon. And they will do so again. Like, they're not really that married to a particular ideology. They defend the ideology of the times. So, in a sense, that is kind of a relief if you're Swedish, because if the US collapses and the American-led order collapses, like Swedish politicians, just for reasons of sort of self-confidence almost, will adapt whatever is new and fancy. But in the UK, I mean, I can imagine like the Fallout London experience, where it's like you have this small circle in Westminster. It's just bombed out ruins outside of Westminster. And there's like these all poor put upon Britons, you know, trying to figure out where to get like the next bottle of pre-war hot sauce for their meal that's like a mutated rat on a stick. And the only thing they're getting from their quote-unquote leaders in Westminster is like, be proud, noble Britain, as you show down on this mutated rat. You're part of the empire, the glorious British Empire. And you still have like these sort of zombies, these ghouls in these funny uniforms that have been preserved for 300 years with the big sort of furry hats and so on. And you have this kind of circus where all of the energy goes into maintaining the spectacle. People in the rest of Europe don't really care that much about the spectacle, and nobody in America is going to be bothering maintaining the spectacle. I mean, they're not even bothering right now. Like all of this stuff about the Constitution, like government by laws, not by man. Like it's all being thrown in the trash can as we record this. So like they're not concerned. But in old Blighty, I mean, they might be. Like, it might be the most sort of dystopian Western society in that way, in that there are incentives to keep the grift going basically forever.